Christmas through the ages. Once again, the world is drawing close to the time in which there is a standstill right across the nations in recognition of this event, which was the turning point in all the history of the world. It happened at Christmas in the majesty of the real and living God, that the eternal Father sent his eternal Son into the world to become our brother, to join our family, and to become one of us forever. That Son came down in the power of the Holy Spirit, took our flesh from the Virgin Mary, and joined our race forever. He came down to lift us up. He became our brother to make us sons and daughters of his own Almighty Father forever, to make us his brothers and sisters, and to bring us into his glorious church with people all across the world. Today, we're going to be going deeper into this wonderful event with the help of another of my favorite early Christian writers, Gregory of Nyssa. Who was Gregory of Nyssa? Well, he was born about 30 years after Athanasius that we looked at last time, around about 335 in Caesarea, which was then the capital of the Roman province of Cappadocia, which is now modern Turkey. Now, Cappadocia had already had a number of outstanding Christian leaders, Gregory, Thaumaturgus, and others, but it would be distinguished by three Christian leaders who are still universally regarded across the Christian church, all in the world today. Gregory of Nyssa, his elder brother Basil of Caesarea, and their friend Gregory Nazianzus or Nazianzen. Now, Gregory of Nyssa's family was a very wealthy and distinguished one, and very strong and committed Christians. His grandparents had suffered greatly in an earlier imperial persecution and had had to flee to the mountains for safety. His father, who was also called Basil, was a distinguished academic, but died when his family was still very young, leaving his wife and her mother to care for 10 children, 5 girls and 5 boys. They did an extremely good job of that, and a number of them went on to do remarkable things. Gregory was the third son and one of the youngest in the family. He suffered from poor health growing up as a child, and so was probably educated at home. Now, his elder brother Basil certainly played a leading role in that education, and later on he would again and again refer to Basil not only as his elder brother, but as his master. He was by disposition quiet, but incredibly bright and powerful intellectual abilities, but would much rather have really stayed at home, studied, and had a quiet life, until he had a powerful vision in which he felt himself being called forward into much more active Christian service. Now, for some reason, he didn't go into ordained ministry at that point, but stepped forward into a more academic career, much to the disappointment of Basil, his elder brother, and his friend Gregory Nazianzus. About 365, so when he was around about 30 years old, the disputes and the opponents of the Council of Nicaea, which had been in 325, were rumbling on and growing. 370, Eusebius of Caesarea, that extraordinary early church historian, died and was replaced by Basil, who became Basil of Caesarea. Now, in order to strengthen his own position and in order to bolster the strength of those that were opposing, those that were seeking to undermine the Council of Nicaea, Basil did a very comical thing, really. Well, he appointed his brother Gregory as the Bishop of Nyssa. a very small town in western Cappadocia. One of his friends immediately questioned why he would have done that, why he would have put a man of the ability of Gregory into such a small place, to which Basil famously replied that he didn't want his brother Gregory to be distinguished by the bishopric which he was going to, but rather to distinguish that whole place by his own abilities and what he would go on to do. It became more and more clear, and as the years rolled on in that role, that it would be one of great suffering, hardship, opposition, and criticism. And yet, Gregory of Nyssa stood firm and continued to contend for the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints. His brother Basil died before the age of 50, and at that point Gregory reluctantly again stepped into the gap of defending the Nicene faith, the orthodox and what was becoming like the historic Christian faith, against all those that were standing against it. He would write extensively against opponents of Nicaea, Eunomius and others, and beautifully set out what the Christian faith actually is. Now, we're only going to look at a very small section of one of those works. It's from chapter 24 of his great catechism. One of the greatest things which he, or indeed which anybody has ever written, a profound understanding and insight into the miracle and mystery of Christmas. Let me just set it up before I read the little section. What's the issue that Gregory was dealing with? Well, the opponents of Nicaea, and of course they were not the only ones before or since, had argued that God, by very definition, is unchanging, high and exalted, and that it would be inappropriate and unfitting, in fact impossible, for the real God in that way to stoop down and to become a member of the human race. It would be impossible to do such a thing, for him to give himself to the world in that way without giving himself away and losing who he in fact was. Can you see the issue? Being brought up in what is still, on the surface at least, a Christian country, and within the Christian church, we may have taken it for granted that what happened at Christmas is easy and should cause no problems for others like outside the Christian church. And yet there are over 1 billion people at least in the world today for whom it's a massive problem. When we speak to our Muslim friends and neighbors, they will tell us that it is impossible for the Allah of the Quran to come down in this way of Christmas and to become a member of the human race without losing his glory and who he in fact is. Now, why is it, let's just step out one moment, let's ask the deeper question, why is it that not only Muslim friends, but also the opponents of Nicaea and countless others across the world should struggle to be able to come to terms with the reality of Christmas in this way? Well, we might say that it reflects something deeper, not peculiar to any world religion, but to what's going on within all of our hearts and minds. What is that? Well, deep down inside all of our hearts and minds, we are proud. We are very proud. Of course, as we grow up, we become more subtle and adept at concealing it through all kinds of social conventions. And yet, beneath it all, we remain proud of our background, our education, our position within society, our abilities, our possessions, where we live. Our hearts are very, very proud. Now, no particular religion or no particular nation has a monopoly upon that. It's true of us all across the world. Our world is proud, characterized by the attempt to climb upwards. And we say it, don't we, all the time. We want to climb the career ladder. We want to climb the housing ladder. We want to climb all kinds of ladders in life where we have to even climbing up on others' shoulders to achieve it, to get as high as we can, to become as great as we can, our own glory. Now, of course, why we're like that is no mystery. It's part of our collective history together, where we went wrong a long time ago in the origins of the human race, turning away from the living God who made us and wanting to assert ourselves, to sit upon the throne of the universe as gods ourselves, to express geographically where we were already within our own hearts and minds. We must say as well that we're not the only ones that are trying to climb up in this way, that there is, of course, another dark, cloaked, hooded figure who is climbing the same direction and who is a co-belligerent and who is in fact leading the charge, the devil, who became proud on account of what he had been given and wanted more, wanted to sit on the throne of the Most High God. And so that pride within our own hearts and minds is what we project up into the heavens and assume that the real God must be like us, must also be climbing upwards, trying to assert himself, doing what's best for himself in the way that we do, naturally and by default, 100 and 1,000 times a day. But what is really the glory and the power of the real God? What is it really? Who of any of us would think that it would be to not climb up, but to come down and to die in horror and shame before a mocking crowd, before people that hated you, stripped naked, falsely accused, dying in blood, sweat, and tears? No God of human creation or invention or human religion would ever dare to do such a thing. And yet the real God once, outside the city of Jerusalem, on the cross of Calvary, died for you and for me. Now, of course, if we know the gospel story, we'll know that there was a Roman centurion, probably a man who was very far away from the real God who was there on that day. And yet amidst all the darkness of what was going on at that time, he exclaimed, "Surely this is the Son of God." Can you see that in the midst of that darkness of all that was unfolding, that man from far away recognized, saw who that really was hanging upon the cross, that in a very strange way, Jesus was revealing himself as he was hiding himself. His light was shining in the darkness more brightly than ever. His strength was being shown more strongly than ever in his weakness. His glory was being set out in his shame and his royalty in this humiliation. Now, why do I say that? I say it for this reason. Do you ever wonder what happened to the people of the Bible afterwards, and what they did and where they went? Well, this man, later church history tells us, was called Longinus. It's said that he was the very soldier who pierced Jesus' side with the spear. It's said also that when the Jewish religious leaders tried to bribe the Roman soldiers to say that Jesus' disciples had stolen his body after he walked out of his own grave, that this Roman centurion Longinus refused to be bribed and in fact became a Christian, left his military service, and went back to his native land to preach to his own people about Jesus that he had seen dying for him upon the cross. Where was this man from? He was from Cappadocia. And so he went back to Cappadocia and preached extensively across the whole region before he was beheaded and gave his life as a martyr for Jesus Christ. 300 years later, Gregory of Nyssa in Cappadocia would write of the glory of the true and living God, the glory of the eternal Son of the Father coming down. And he would say this remarkable thing, that far from his coming down into the world as our brother at Christmas being something which was unbecoming or impossible for him, rather it was his greatest glory to come down in that way. Let me read to you what Gregory said in chapter 24 of his great catechism. This is what he said. Got to concentrate. He's a very powerful thinker. This is what he says. In the first place, then, that the omnipotence or the power of the divine nature should have had strength to descend to the humiliation of humanity furnishes a clearer proof of that omnipotence than even the greatness and supernatural character of the miracles. For that something preeminently great should be wrought out by divine power is in this manner, in accordance with and consequent upon the divine nature. Nor is it startling to hear it said that the whole of the created world and all that is understood to be beyond the range of visible things subsists by the power of God, his will giving it existence according to his own good pleasure. Now this is the key bit. Listen to this. This is so powerful. But this, his descent to the humility of man, is a kind of superabundant exercise of his power, which thus finds no check even in directions which contravene nature. In like manner, it's not the vastness of the heavens and the bright shining of its constellations and the order of the universe and the unbroken administration over all existence that so manifestly displays the transcendent power of the deity. Can you see? Let me just break it. See what he's saying? So he's saying the glory, the splendor, the majesty, the scale of the entire cosmos. That's very small in reflecting the glory of this real God compared to this condescension to the weakness of our nature, the way, in fact, in which sublimity, existing in lowliness, is actually seen in lowliness and yet descends not from its height, and in which deity, entwined as it is with the nature of man, becomes this and yet still is that. Powerful, profound. Can we see what he's saying? That far from the eternal Son coming down at Christmas being something which was impossible or unfitting for him, it is in fact his greatest glory to do this for you and for me. Now, this train of thought was picked up by two much later Christian writers, and let's just see how they unpack it, because they both do it so beautifully. The first is C.S. Lewis. I'm sure you know C.S. Lewis in his Great Divorce. Well, not his own personal great divorce, but the book, His Great Divorce. This is where he put it like this. The higher a thing is, the lower it can descend. A man can sympathize with a horse, but a horse cannot sympathize with a rat. Can you see it again? The powerful way in which it's unpacked. His highness and his glory is to come down to where we are in this glorious way at Christmas time. Secondly, Karl Barth, that extraordinary Swiss 20th century theologian, put it beautifully like this in unpacking the way, not just in terms of the incarnation at Christmas, but also the direction towards the cross of Calvary. Far from it being him losing who he is, listen to what Barth says, beautiful. The question, whether and willing to let this happen to him, that is the death of the cross, he has not renounced and lost himself as God, whether in capitulating to the folly and wickedness of his creature, he has not abdicated from his deity, whether he can really die and be dead. And it's a matter of the answer to this question, that in this humiliation, God is supremely God. That in this death, he is supremely alive. That he has maintained and revealed his deity in the passion of this man as his eternal Son. Oh, isn't that so awesome? Let me just draw it together what Nyssa, Lewis and Barth are trying to say with a very simple illustration to help us bring it home. I'll never forget the time growing up when the pastor of the small Baptist church that I was brought up in Downpatrick, County Down, in Northern Ireland, shared with us of the way in which a very brilliant and distinguished man came to visit our church. It was a small church in a small town, and we didn't have the privilege of meeting people like that very often. But this man was able to speak 8 languages fluently and went with the pastor to a care home where they were having a small carol service with the elderly residents. And the pastor shared the beautiful story of how, when it came to singing the carols, this brilliant man, far from standing aloof and standing back from the elderly residents there, rather took one of the song sheets and knelt down beside one of those people and held the sheet for them. And as the pastor of our church shared this story, he broke down in tears. It so moved him to think that that brilliant man would have stooped down to help that person on that day. Can you see how that's a very small picture and shadow of the way in which the high and glorious one, Jesus Christ, the eternal Son of God, the master of the universe and founder of the galaxies, came down to you and to me at Christmas time, to where we are, wherever we think we are in our minds and in our hearts, high and exalted. We're not really. We're very lowly. We desperately need help, and he didn't hold that against us, but he came down, and that was his greatest glory. This Christmas time, may his coming down to save us and to lift us up be the end of all of our pride in ourselves, and be the beginning of our bowing before him in love and worship and adoration and praise, and of boasting no longer in ourselves but in him. Jeremiah chapter 9 verse 23. This is what the Lord says: let not the wise man boast of his wisdom, or the strong man boast of his strength, or the rich man boast of his riches, but let him who boasts boast about this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord who exercises kindness, justice, and righteousness on the earth, for in these I delight, declares the Lord. Amen.